good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Paul Allison. I'm doing a part-time PhD here at Newcastle. And tonight I'm going to talk about some trials I ran this summer, investigating intermixed companion planting in forage brassicas as a defence against flea beetle. And just to note, this is not the glamorous Hollywood world of cabbage stem flea beetle with their money and their facilities. This is grubby little flea beetle on beef and sheep farms. And I think we're supposed to introduce ourselves a little bit. So I did a plant science degree at Leeds, and then I did a master's in ruminant nutrition at Farmer School, and now I'm doing a part-time PhD here at Newcastle, but that was a really long time ago, and that's what really happened. So now I spend half my time doing this, half my time farming, and half my time doing some contract work that pays my bills. So I'm going to explain why forage brassicas are important, why flea beetles are an issue, why I thought companion planting was worth a try, what I did, what I found, and whether any of it matters or not. And flea beetles are also, of course, well-known pests in the garden and the allotment. And they hammer brassicas like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbages, and also non-brassicas like lettuce. They are a problem, and there's not a great deal of work being done on them. So this is a forage brassica. This is kale. Good dog. So you also get rape, swede, and turnips. They're planted in spring. You get a really high dry matter per hectare, and they're highly nutritious. They're relatively winter hardy, and they're grazed rather than being harvested and conserved. And when you have a full summer of photosynthesis, you can get really big crops. So it's a way of keeping all that photosynthetic energy stored without having to cut it and make silage or hay. If you've got any questions at the end, can you start by saying those cows look brilliant? So you strip graze it in autumn and winter, often with supplementary silage. They're behind temporary electric fencing, and you give them you move that electric fence every day. You give them a new daily allocation of what they need to eat. You get some soil damage, but it's concentrated in a small area of farm, and that's really important. And you get a great entry into a pasture reseed using this system. So they matter because this is a very cheap wintering system for cattle and sheep. You save all the costs of housing cattle. So economically, on livestock farms, when you use this system, it tends to be a really critical component of the whole farm system. But of course, there is a problem. I'm such a child. Flea beetle. And I used to really dislike flea beetle, and I really hate them now. People study insects because they like them, and I can't stand them. They're horrible things, and they eat your plants. So the flea beetle love eating brassicas, and you get this really distinctive shot hole damage. You'll have seen it in the garden in cabbages, and total crop loss is not unusual. And often farmers will put an early kale in, and they'll say, well, if the crop fails, I'll put rape in afterwards. So people are accepting losses. So, the flea beetle life cycle perfectly matches spring planted forage brassicas. So they come out of diapause, out of hibernation in winter, just at the time that the plant is at its most vulnerable. So you get cotyledon stage and early growth stage, and the flea beetles are at their hungriest. They invade the crops and they start feeding. Adult males emit a pheromone, and the plants emit damage response chemicals, and you get a clustering and aggregation effect, so you'll get a load of flea beetles on one plant. There's some evidence that flea beetle will selectively predate one type of brassica over another. and the way in which they invade crops changes as the weather warms up in spring. So they start by crawling out of the field edges, making really slow progress into the crop. And then as the weather warms up, they get more active and they start hopping. And once they start hopping, they really start to make quite quick progress into the crop. And then, of course, they start flying, and then they can fly in quite large numbers through the countryside and sort of move kilometres in groups until they get intercepted by a crop and they land on it and they start feeding. And there's no chemical defences anymore. We used to have neonicotinoids, which everybody doesn't like, but they stopped flea beetle in their tracks. There's pyrethroid resistance. The only people that recommend pyrethroid use are people who sell pyrethroids. So you have this low certainty of crop success. Similar effect in oilseed rape and cabbage stem flea beetle. And as a result of neonicotinoid withdrawal, there's been a 50% fall in oilseed rape area in the country since 2018. Nobody keeps records for forage brassicas in livestock farms because nobody cares about them, apart from me. There are some potential non-chemical defences. Fiddling about with your planting dates, trying to miss the rise of the flea beetles can help, but it's sort of luck rather than judgment. Big seed rate helps. More seeds, more plants, same number of flea beetles, less damage per plant, and maybe you'll get under critical levels. And there are other things that people mess about with that sort of work, like putting slurry or manure on just before you plant your crop. And in the last couple of years, me and farmers that I know have been we've been putting just weird things in the kale crops just to see if they have any effect. And it's just sort of, we say we've been experimenting, but we've just been messing about, really. So I think it's worth trying. It's a big problem in an important farming system. Farmers think it's worth trying to find some alternative means of flea beetle protection. And there's a hierarchy of attractiveness that suggests that some plants are more attractive to flea beetle than others. And an intermixed trap crop would help defend against the flyers as well as the crawlers and the hoppers. And of course, it's farming and ecology, so what could possibly go wrong? I just want to show you this. So this is 2 slides from last year on our farm. On the left is July, on the right is the same crop in October. And I put tillage radish and some berseem clover in. And I thought I'd just completely ruined the crop because I thought I'd put far too much of that in. But they flower and senesce in August and the kale keeps growing and fills the gaps in. So it's one of the aspects of this crop that lends itself to intermixed companion planting if they die off before the kale really starts to fill in and get going. So these are the questions I asked myself. Can intermixed intercropped trap plants in forage brassicas under flea beetle pressure affect flea beetle density, main crop damage, and main crop yield, and what are the optimal trap plant densities? And I planted 6 trial plots on 4 farms, plus another slightly different trial plot on a farm. The farmer planted kale. I went afterwards and overseeded various different seed treatments. For the purposes of this, it was brown mustard, tillage radish, and fodder radish, oversown in square plots, subplots. And that's what it looked like. A hectare of kale was overseeded in up and down and side to side. So I had all sorts of complex combinations of plants. And so the first things that went wrong were those evil little flea beetles decided not to turn up this year. So all these crops, I selected these farms because they have a history of flea beetle problems. And this year, there was very few flea beetle around. So if I didn't hate them enough already, they were really starting to annoy me by about June time. Other things want to eat kale, and there's weeds. So I lost plots to weeds. One had to be ploughed out. And I'll be talking mainly about what I call plot A and another plot C. Plot A had a reasonable amount of flea beetle. Well, reasonable for me. Good for me, bad for the farmer. So then there was things that were definitely my fault. I made mistakes of all sorts. I had slightly too much mustard in the mixture, and because I had different means of establishment, the kale was drilled in, and my plants were overseeded. I had different differential germination rates between the two types of plants. And I knew this was going to be a problem. I couldn't tell the difference between mustard and kale at cotyledon stage. I mean, if I'd spent a day on one, I maybe could have, but I had thousands to look at, so I gave that up as a bad job. So I've got some results to share with you, but I just thought I'd tell you about the guidance I was given for this talk. I'm told that you don't like graphs, so over the weekend I spent some time thinking of alternative ways to present my results to you, and I couldn't think of any. And I really love a graph, so I think we have locked the doors. So this is when I looked at flea beetle numbers in July, the beginning of July. Each of these three is a plot that contains mustard and radish. These four are plots that don't contain mustard and radish, and I found far more flea beetle per day in the plots with mustard and radish in them. And when I lumped all the plots together, the subplots that had mustard in them, and lumped all the subplots that didn't have mustard in them together, it became quite plain there was something going on, and the flea beetle were being attracted into plots that contain mustard and radish. This is over some time, so these two are black is no mustard, red is some mustard, measured 3 times, 16th of June, 5th of July, 21st of July. An increasing, this is flea beetles per day, an increasing number of flea beetles per day, but they are concentrating in the plots that have mustard and radish in, and there is no increase in the plots that don't have mustard and radish in. And these were reasonable numbers doing a reasonable amount of damage. And this is a different plot, and I had the same effect, albeit with fewer numbers overall, but I had the same effect. This is what the damage looks like. That is a kale plant, and next to it is a mustard plant. Kale plants, mustard plants. And you can just see, as I could see, it was absolutely obvious walking around the fields, that the mustard and the tillage radish and the fodder radish were getting hammered by the flea beetle, and the kale was kind of doing all right. And when I plotted up my results, I found that mustard and radish plants were more damaged. This is a damage graph than kale plants. The kale are the dark black, and the mustard and radish are the grey. So wherever they were on the site, whatever was happening, they were getting preferentially eaten by the flea beetle compared to the kale. And so the mustard and radish plots have far more flea beetle in them, but the kale in those plots has far less damage from flea beetle. So more flea beetle, less damage, which I'm still quite surprised at that. But that's what happened. So, of course, what farmers are interested in is yield. So I did a lot of yield measurements, and I got a slightly weird set of graphs. But essentially, as I have more mustard and radish plants, more mustard radish plants per square metre, I get less kale yield, which is what you would expect. Kale is really sensitive to competition as a plant. But it's when you smooth out the graph, it's not a straight line, and there is a delayed onset of yield reduction due to the competition, which I think is probably to do with the protection the kale plants were receiving from the increased number of flea beetles. Because what I can't say is by how much, or what I can't measure, because I didn't do it, is if the whole field was a mixture of kale and mustard and radish, what would happen? because I had a patchwork of different treatments, and flea beetle were being pulled into and concentrated in areas with mustard and radish. So what would have happened if I'd spread the mustard and radish over the whole field and the flea beetle had just wandered around evenly distributed over the whole field? So if you want to know about the maths, ask me afterwards. But when I go through the maths, I'm predicting that damage to kale plants in a kale-only plot will be 16.4% with that number of flea beetle that were in the field, evenly spread. And I'm predicting that damage to kale plants with intermixed mustard in that same situation, the only difference being intermixed mustard and radish, would be 2.8%, which is a massive reduction in flea beetle damage from planting mustard and radish in with it. But that's a prediction. It's not a measurement. 83% is a huge number, and I'm really cautious about it. There was a lot of assumptions and there was a lot of variability. This is one field, 1 year. And I think quite importantly, the mean density of the mustard and radish in these mustard subplots was higher than would be sensible from a kale yield point of view. So, just to recap, there's more flea beetles in subplots with mustard and radish. Flea beetle density increases with mustard and radish density. There's more damage to mustard and radish plants than to kale plants, always. There's less damage to kale plants in subplots with mustard and radish, even though there are more flea beetle in those subplots. And I predict intermixed mustard will protect kale at field scale. The yield penalty from plant competition in this context was not linear from 0. So what I don't know is exactly in the lower densities of mustard and radish, what is just enough to cause this protection effect. Because I think it's somewhere under 4 plants per square metre. But I don't have enough data in that area, in that range between 0 and 4 to be able to say. So, if this work is to continue, it needs an assessment of the effects of lower mustard and radish density. It needs to be repeated, so I'm never going to plant kale again without some mustard and radish. I'd just be stupid, knowing what I know now. And I'd really like to know what the cotyledon stage effects are, and I can imagine an experiment that would help with that. Landscape scale effects are important. If the mustard and radish is attracting flea beetle from the next door farm, that's really, really bad. But I don't think they are. The literature suggests that this is not an attraction, it's sort of an interception rather than a pulling attraction. And if there are any pull effects, their range is less than 10 metres. So I'm sort of comfortable about that, but I haven't measured it. And it'd be nice to know whether it's the brown mustard, the tillage radish, or the fodder radish that matters. I think it's the brown mustard, because I had far more brown mustard in my mix through one of my mistakes that were my fault. So really, a lot of this is just measuring mustard. And it would be nice to know where the Goldilocks zone is with these things. So, that's that. Any questions?